I'm Mary Willingham, long-time member of this church, and many years ago, we had a class here on C.S. Lewis, and David Curl was 16. And that's why. And in fact, I thought he'd probably be here today, and he might still come in. And he loved that class. And it went for years and years. So there's no end to what you can talk about when you study C.S. Lewis. And he was definitely not a perfect person. He had many flaws, and even his theology. He had flaws in his theology, and we'll try to touch on a few of those as we go through. There'll be 3 sessions for his life and work. The first one will be his life and his conversion experience. He was a rabid atheist, and but eventually was converted. And the second session will be on the Great Divorce and the Screwtape letters and that Hideous string, which is my favorite of his science fiction trilogy. And we'll talk about those next week. And also The Weight of Glory, which is a wonderful set of sermons that he preached during the war and right after World War II. About the inner circle and the dangers of wandering in the inner circle. So that's what we'll do. And then the last session, we will talk about Narnia. So you have to, his most famous stuff is Narnia. Okay, so let's look at his life. He was born in the winter of 1898 in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And he was an Irish, he was considered to be an Irish citizen. And I suppose all those that were born in Northern Ireland were also Irish citizens. His mother was the daughter of a clergyman, and she had a very cheerful and tranquil disposition. His father was mercurial and given to emotional outbursts, which caused Lewis to be estranged from his father for his whole life, practically. Both parents were well educated and bookish, and he had an older brother, Warren. And Lewis and Warnie, as his older brother was called, were very close their whole lives. They, after they shared a home when they were adults, and after Lewis married Joy Davidman, they all 3 lived together in the same house. It was called the Kilns, and they all lived there and the rest of their lives. Interesting tidbits that you might not know about C.S. Lewis. He had a phobia and nightmares about insects. They suggest machines that have come to life. This is what he said. You may add that in the hive and anthill, we see fully realized 2 things that some most dread for our own species. I had to put this in. The dominance of the female and the dominance of the collective. So he was at a young age, he didn't know too many women, girls, and was worried about that issue. And he also was never a fan of any kind of collective organization, any kind of collective group. He would have been, say, very anti-communist. He had a hand deformity, and he had only one working joint in his thumbs, the one closest to the nail. The other joint was unbendable, and so this made him very poor in sports. And so he, anything that had to do with the ball, he could not do. Couldn't work at it. He was also terrible at math. I didn't put that up. And he would not have gotten into Oxford if he had not joined the military at the outbreak of World War I and served in the military, when he came back, they waived the math entrance requirement. Otherwise, he would not have. Now, one of his conversion experiences was something he calls joy, and that is this strange and wonderful and mysterious feeling that people get from time to time. And it's also kind of a longing for something that you don't know what it is you're longing for. People have called it a longing for home, a longing for rest. We've been called sojourners by people like, personality, people like that. So this is a picture of a toy garden. Once in those very early days, my brother brought into the nursery the lid of a biscuit tin, which he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers, so as to make it a toy garden or a toy forest. That was the first beauty I ever knew. As long as I live, my imagination of paradise will retain something of my brother's toy garden. There it is. Now that's not the same toy garden, but it is a very cute toy garden. When Louis was little, his family moved into a very large house, and he loved to be in the upper level of the house, and he staked out a claim to one of the attic rooms, and he made it my study. Pictures of my own making, and here my first stories were written and illustrated with enormous satisfaction. They were an attempt to combine my two chief literary pleasures, dressed animals and knights in armor. Now, he claims, I'm going to show you a picture of one of his dressed animals that he drew. So, although he could not use a pair of scissors, so he could not make the toy castles that he loved, he could write and he could draw. And here is one of his characters, Lord Big. And C.S. Lewis drew this under the age of 10. And many, many others. He and his brother created a whole imaginary world called Buxton. And they would spend hours and hours creating this imaginary world and write long, long stories. And all of them had political things, because he said that was the only conversation he ever heard in his house were about politics. So he would have all these characters. And here's another one of his drawings. Viscount Puddiphat and Friends. And Lewis drew these, which I just find is totally amazing.
Under the age of 10?
Under the age of 10. Puddiphat and more friends. I mean, the perspective and all of that is just amazing. But it wasn't to be a happy childhood past the age of 10, because at the age of 10, Lewis's mother died of cancer. And he said, with my mother's death, all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable disappeared from my life. There was to be much fun, many pleasures, many stabs of joy, but no more of the old security. It was sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis. So until he was 10, Lewis's mother had homeschooled him. And she taught him Latin and French and writing and how to think and how to be creative. So she taught him very well until he was 10, and then he went off to England to school. The first school that he went to was Wynard, his first boarding school in England. There were only about 18 boys in the school, and the headmaster was going insane. And so it was a very terrible situation, terrible place. The school finally failed, and Lewis was sent to Campbell, which was another school, a school not far from his home, and he stayed there until he became ill with some kind of respiratory illness, was brought home, and his father finally sent him to Cherbourg House and Wyvern, were proper boarding schools where his brother had been. And so that's where he spent his middle school and high school years. And he said that, "I can even remember from those days what must have been the first metaphysical argument I ever took part in. A group of boys and I debated whether the future was like a line you can't see or a line that is not yet drawn." So you can see, even at a very early age, he was already thinking metaphysically. That's a picture of C.S. Lewis on the left, on the right, and the father in the middle, and Warnie on the left. And let me tell you a little bit about Jack. When he was 4 years old, he had a dog named Jackie, and his dog was killed in some kind of accident. And so at age 4, he marches into his parents, and he says, my new name is Jack, and I want you to call me that. And for the rest of his life, everyone called him Jack. And his dog. He was an atheist from very early on, and he was also a pessimist. Ridiculous as it may sound, I believe that the clumsiness of my hands was at the root of the matter. How could this be? Not certainly that a child says, "I can't cut a straight line with a pair of scissors, therefore the universe is evil." Perhaps I had better call it a settled expectation that everything would do what you did not want it to do. And I thought, lots of people can identify with that situation, right? As a young boy, Lewis was pessimistic about the world and universe, largely because of the death of his mother and his hand deformity. Not only did he believe that everything would do what you did not want it to, and that the universe was a menacing and unfriendly place, but, and this is Lewis's words, "I felt the force of Lucretius' argument. Surely it is the strongest of all for atheism. Had God designed the world, it would not be a world so frail and faulty as we see." So he was already thinking, this in this kind of intellectual sense, that the world, how could we have a loving God that created such a dreadful world? Reading the classics, the impression I got was that religion in general, though utterly false, was a natural growth, a kind of endemic nonsense into which humanity tended to blunder. I had very definitely formed the opinion that the universe was, in the main, a rather regrettable While still in school at Wyvern, Lewis wrote a play about the Greek gods that was, as he said, very pessimistic. It was also, showed his brilliance early on. I was at this time living like so many atheists or anti-theists in a whirl of contradictions. I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing. I was equally angry with him for creating a world. In his play, Lewis has his main character, Loki, complain that Odin should never have created a world. Why should creatures have the burden of existence forced on them without their consent? And he used to say, I didn't ask to be born, and why should I have been born? So those early parts of his. Lewis's atheism was greatly reinforced when he went to study with the great Knock. Now, he's now about 15. this was William Kirkpatrick, whose atheism was based on the rational idea that it was absurd to think of God as a judgmental old man with a white beard in the clouds who allowed such evil to exist in the world. And so when he studied with the great Knock, there were only like 2 or 3 boys in the home, and religion was just not talked about, period. It was as if it didn't exist. There's the great Knock. So when Lewis was about 16, he wrote about, he always loved nature, loved to be outside, and loved long walks. And he used to wander in the countryside while at school at Little Bookham, which is the great Knox village. And there he studied and thought a great deal. He was so happy in this environment that he thought that he was perhaps selfish, but not self-centered, because his mind was never on himself, but on 1,000 other intellectual ideas and discoveries. And so he thought about what is the difference between being selfish and self-centered. And this is what he came up with. One of the happiest men and most pleasing companions I have ever known was intensely selfish. On the other hand, I have known people capable of real sacrifice, whose lives were nevertheless a misery to themselves and to others because self-concern and self-pity filled all their thoughts. But either condition will destroy the soul. So Lewis loved to walk in nature, and the hiking in the English countryside was a lifelong hobby of his. He did it up until he died. And these are some of his walks. Loved to walk. And he especially liked to walk in the winter time. So here's a winter walk. And this is what he said about walking in the winter. On a Saturday afternoon in winter, when nose and fingers might be pinched enough to give an added relish to the anticipation of tea and fireside, and the whole weekend's reading lay ahead, I suppose I reached as much happiness as is ever to be reached on earth, and especially if there were some new long-coveted book. He spent all of his spare money on books when he was 15 and 16, and he also loved tea and said, "You can never get a teapot big enough for me or a book long enough." But still an atheist. The horror of the Christian universe was that it had no door marked exit. What mattered most of all was my deep-seated hatred of authority, and all of this is very true. He quickly realized he had these characteristics. My monstrous individualism, my lawlessness. No word in my vocabulary expressed deeper hatred than the word interference. His whole life he wanted to do what he wanted to do, which is kind of a universal trait, right? But Christianity placed at the center what then seemed to me a transcendental interferer. So he's, of course, thinking ahead to Jesus. All right. So he graduates or leaves the grade Knock, and he goes to Oxford. He passes, of course, all the written English exams, Latin and French and Greek and all of those. He was very fluent in that. And his college was University College. And in fact, this is a picture actually of the college. And I can't remember now whether his rooms were on the left or the right, but you can actually see that there. Right before Lewis left Little Bookham for Oxford, he read a book by George MacDonald, Fantasies. In a later introduction to that book, Lewis writes, "The quality which had enchanted me in his imaginative work turned out to be the quality of the real universe, the divine, magical, terrifying, and ecstatic reality in which we all live. The quality that Lewis felt he found in those the books that he read, or the essays, was goodness and holiness. And you can begin to see here, Lewis was very much a reader of physics. And you don't see that too much in his direct writings, but you can see the glimpses of it in stuff like this: the divine, magical, terrifying, ecstatic reality. He once told someone, in the Screwtape letters, the devil tells the younger devil, try to get your patient interested in scientists, but not the real scientists, not the physicists, because he said they are very dangerous to the young devil. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to Screwtape. So Lewis was now just barely admitted to Oxford, and we have the First World War. So Lewis joined the army. He quit school, as did many of his colleagues, friends. Joined the army at the beginning of World War I. As an Irish subject, Lewis could have easily gained an exemption, and Lewis's father begged him not to sign up, but to no avail. Lewis was commissioned as a second lieutenant. Lewis was commissioned as a second lieutenant and sent to the front line trenches in France on his 19th birthday. And here is a picture of Lewis in his uniform. He actually saw fighting, and he was wounded in the trenches in 1918 by a shell that killed his sergeant and friend. So he was fairly severely wounded. I think he had shrapnel for the rest of his life. But while he was in the hospital, Lewis picked up a copy of G.K. Chesterton's essays because there was nothing else to read. He writes, "I cannot quite understand why he made such an immediate conquest of me. It might have been expected that my pessimism, my atheism, and my hatred of sentiment would have made him to me the least congenial of all authors." But Lewis liked his writing for a kind of goodness that he found in it. But still, I think that I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them, and from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. All religions are merely man's own invention, Christ as much as Loki. Primitive man found himself surrounded by all sorts of terrible things he didn't understand. Thus, religion, that is to say, mythology, grew up. And one of Lewis's favorite books was Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods. So you can see his interest in all kinds of mythological things. And all this is foreshadowing, of course, his later writing and his later work with Narnia. He loved mythology, he loved nature, the mysterious, and without realizing it at first, he was later to know that these experiences gave him glimpses of what he would call true joy. So they were his interest in mythology, magic, and all of those kinds of things were actually moving him along towards his conversion experience.
Was that his artwork?
Was what?
Was that his artwork?
No, that was not his. So after the war, he returned to Oxford, determined to remain a devoted atheist. Lewis began his studies again and shunned all thoughts of the supernatural, romanticism, and immortality. As he wrote, all one's thoughts must be confined to the very world, which is the world of all of us, the place where in the end we find our happiness, or not at all. And you're going to see such a radical shift from this view that the world is everything to his eventual feeling that the world is only just a stop along the way. However, the Hound of Heaven, or the Hounds of Heaven, were really after him. After getting his first degree in philosophy, Lewis spent another year at Oxford studying English and making friends, and to his great dismay, he found that his most respected authors and friends were either Christian or leaned in that direction. All the others he found lacking. He said, Christians are wrong, but all the rest are right. And he said, so the Hounds of Heaven are still after him now. So he said, in reading Chesterton, as in reading MacDonald, I did not know what I was letting myself in for. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere. God is, if I may say it, very unscrupulous. And the book Surprised by Joy, which a lot of this is from, is he talks about, that it's as if God is drawing the noose, and reeling him in, little by little. So Lewis decided he would, perhaps give in and maybe believe in God. So he said because Lewis wanted nature to be quite independent of our observation, something other, indifferent, self-existing, he realized the contradiction of this ultimately deterministic approach with his own literary and aesthetic experiences of abstract thought and moral judgment. He wanted everything to be determined and materialistic, but in his own mind he was very imaginative. All the people he was with were very imaginative and creative, and he realized that those two things were in contradiction. So, and they presented a kind of an enormous contradiction for him. So he became a theist. He was believing in God. But this was a religion that cost nothing. We could talk religiously about the absolute, but there was no danger of its doing anything about us. It was there, safely and immovably there. It would never come here. Never, to be blunt, make a nuisance of itself. It is more important that heaven should exist, that is in the abstract, than that any of us should reach it. And you'll see this is going to evolve into a complete change of things. And, as he says, my adversary began to make his final moves. And of course, you know who the character is. That is J.R.R. Tolkien, and Lewis became fast friends with him for the rest of his life, even though they had a little falling out towards the end, but basically they were fast friends their whole life. And and J.R.R. Tolkien was a Roman Catholic, went to Mass every day, was a believer, and and I don't think he really tried to convert Lewis, but they would have these long philosophical discussions, and on a long walk one night with his friend John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, Lewis became convinced that the biblical story of Jesus was not the myth he had previously thought it was. And this long walk was the night that he basically sort of began his deep conversion to Christianity. And up until then, he had thought that the biblical story was just a myth, like a lot of the myths that he... And then he talks about, if you read the Gospels, they don't read like literature. They don't read even like history. He calls them at one place sort of crude realism. They're just something that nobody really had seen before. They have the ring of truth. They have the ring of authenticity. And Lewis was such a critic of literature and all of this that he could discern, what was a myth literary kind of creation, and what sort of had this authentic ring to it. If ever a myth had become fact, had been incarnated, it would be just like this. And nothing else in all literature was just like this. Myths were like it in one way. Histories were like it in another. But nothing was simply like it. And no person was like the person it depicted. That is Jesus. As real, as recognizable through all that depth of time as Plato's Socrates or Boswell's Johnson, yet also numinous, lit by a light from beyond the world, a God. But if a God, we are no longer polytheists, then not a God, but God. Here and here only in all time, the myth must have become fact. The word flesh, God, man. This is not a religion nor a philosophy. It is the summing up and actuality of them all. And then Lewis went to the zoo. He took a trip with his brother. This is not them, but it was in a car, a motorcycle like that. Took a trip to the zoo. And Lewis said, when we set out, I did not believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And when we reached the zoo, I did. It was like when a man, after a long sleep, still lying motionless in bed, becomes aware that he is now awake. And this kind of sums up Lewis's sort of the reason for his conversion. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. So he bases, most of his conversion was based on his longing for something that he could never attain in this world. Now, there's another, we were talking about joy and his. So, Lewis was in his 50s, and he met a real joy. And she eventually became his wife. And I love the fact that he was always longing for joy, and the joy came into his life. Joy Davidman Gresham was a brilliant writer. One of her famous books is on the Ten Commandments, and it's called Smoke on the Mountain. She's a multi-award-winning poet, novelist, and much more. No connection. She was as brilliant as C.S. Lewis. They both had photographic minds, and she was a sophomore in high school at age 11 and finished college at age 15 and received her master's degree from Columbia. As the author of a new book on joy writes, everything about joy seemed ill-matched for an Oxford Don and author of Narnia living in England. When they were 10 years in correspondence and finally 3 years in marriage. But when they first had their first exchange of letters, she was a married woman who lived in upstate New York with her 2 young sons. And she was a converted Jew, a former atheist, and an ex-communist. On paper, there was not a more improbable pair. Everything blocked the way to love, but in the end, it was not impossible at all. Joy first wrote to C.S. Lewis in 1950 while married to Bill Gresham. Joy and Bill had moved from their atheism, but found that they had many doubts and that loving God was hard. And so they wrote to Lewis for advice about this. In 1952, Joy traveled to England to meet Lewis and to work on a book she was writing. Over the next 8 years, Joy divorced her abusive husband. He was an alcoholic and a womanizer and abusive to her. So she writes to Lewis about these problems. She moved to England with her 2 sons and fell in love with C.S. Lewis. And Helen Joy Davidman and C.S. Lewis were married in 1956, and as Lewis writes in A Grief Observed, which is after she died, for those few years, H and I feasted on love, every mode of it, solemn and merry, romantic and realistic, sometimes dramatic as a thunderstorm, sometimes as comfortable and unemphatic as putting on your soft slippers. No cranny of heart or body remained unsatisfied. And that's what they looked like shortly before her death. They were together only 3 or 4 years, probably. Joy died in 1960. Lewis writes, once very near the end, and I've always loved this little quotation, I said, Mrs. Clinton she was on her deathbed. She said, if you can, if it is allowed, come to me when I too am on my deathbed. Aloud, she said, heaven would have a job to hold me, and as for hell, I'd break it into bits. It was Joy's friendship, intellect, writing, encouragement, and love that influenced most notably these books of Lewis, Till We Have Faces, Surprised by Joy, Reflections on the Psalms, and A Grief Observed. Many times she was both inspiration and co-author. And there's a brand new book out about Joy, and it's Becoming Mrs. Lewis, just out a few months ago, actually. And it's about their love stories. And it's from the point of view of Joy. Everything's always been written from the point of view of C.S. Lewis, and this is from her point of view, and you get her dynamic personality in this book. Well-written book. Clyde Staples Lewis lived and valued a modest, simple life. Although he had quite a lot of money in his later years from his books, he gave most of it away. He never had a savings account. He thought one should live a balanced life. He was loved a very simple life, and thought that was the very best way for all people to live. And here are the main things that he thought about. C.S. Lewis believed these kinds of things, and paying attention to one's conscience. He thought everybody had a conscience, and that people needed to listen to their conscience more. Bearing the present cross. He thought everybody had problems, and that you have to bear those. Receiving the present grace from friends, family, strangers, whatever. And giving thanks for the present gifts. So I think Lewis felt throughout most of his life after he converted that these were the important things to live. Here's his final picture. I'd like to get rid of that thing. So that's really it. Now there'll be 2 more sessions, but next week we will talk about the problem of the inner circle and heaven and hell. And Lewis was very concerned about the desire that people have to belong to the inner circle, to belong, which he said is like an onion. There is no real inner circle. And so that's one of the main things we're going to talk about next week. And we'll talk about the weight of glory, which is his little book of presentations, not sermons so much, that he gave during the war and right after the war. That hideous strength, which is the third volume in his science fiction trilogy. My favorite one of those. That's why we're doing it. And the Screwtape letters, which I hope everyone has read, and The Great Divorce, which is also famous. So those are the four ones we're going to talk about.